Wesley So was the winner of the Chessable Masters, the latest online rapid play tournament in the Champions Chess Tour. And it was a very convincing win. He is on superb form at the moment, at least in these rapid play events. It'll be interesting to see how he plays when he gets back to classical chess. Anyway, he has the black pieces here and he's playing against Jorden Van Foreest. And you can see it's a Spanish. I've shown you quite a lot of games where white wins in the Spanish. I wanted to show you what happens, when black is more successful. Spoiler! Wesley actually wins this game. So, Jorden Van Foreest with white. And he plays this move d3, which is, a very popular continuation at the moment. Rook e1 is the main line Spanish, of course, but d3 has a good reputation at the moment. It looks more modest. Magnus Carlsen likes playing like this. Many other strong players like playing like this. Now he goes for c3 here. Remember, black would very much like to take that bishop, so knight a5 is a kind of threat at the moment. So c3 meets that threat. You can play a4 or a3 as well. h3, and now here Wesley decides what to do about that knight. You can go back into a kind of Breyer variation with knight b8, but he goes for knight a5 and comes back into a kind of Chigorin formation. And now we have exactly a Chigorin, except the rook is on f1 and not on e1. It's funny. I mean, it makes a little bit of a difference because it takes a bit more time for white to carry out this maneuver, but white has other options as well. Anyway, knight d7, standard move in these kind of positions, allows the knight perhaps to go to b6, and maybe bishop f6 is coming as well, perhaps after black takes, and then bishop f6 is an option. So here, white can play knight d2, lots of moves, but d5. So that gives the position, obviously a very closed nature for the time being. And very often, I like this kind of space advantage for white. But here, because the knight has moved to d7 quite quickly, then black has the option to play f5 at quite an early stage. Obviously makes it easier to achieve that when white's pawn is on d5. So watch out for that one. Knight b6. Well, I mean, there's no threat to move the knight into c4 at the moment, but Van Foreest plays b3 anyway. I think that's partly because he didn't want to have to face c4, and then the knight potentially coming around here means after c4, of course, you can just close the position with b4 if you want to. Bishop d7, bishop e3. And here, knight d2 is played. I think it's better to play bishop h6 and then knight d2. And here's the reason that after knight d2, Wesley very cleverly plays king g7 to stop bishop h6. So that means that f5 has more menace because then f4 really is a kind of threat. Queen c1 played here, but to meet f5, you could play knight h2. So if f5, f4, and then we get one of those mad positions where the whole the centre and kingside could explode. But those knights on the queen side are a bit offside actually. So knight h2 is an option for white. Queen c1 is an interesting move. Why did he play that? Well, we're about to find out. f5, b4, takes. Now, of course, the move black would like to play is to put that knight into c4. What a beautiful square that is. Beautiful square, but unfortunately allows bishop h6 check, winning that rook on f8. And now we can see why the queen went to c1. So black has to play the move you don't really want to play in these kind of positions, knight b7. And you can see that knight on b7 is dominated by the pawn on b4, and it takes many moves for that knight to get back to a sensible position. Queen b2. f4. Well, it's not all bad for black. because with f4, black forces that bishop to exchange itself off. And suddenly, all those dart squares, that's a very inviting diagonal for that queen. And you never know, there could be a stage where that bishop mounts round to b6. Could be very nice. On the downside, from black's viewpoint, that knight is still not terribly good on b7. But it does have a potential route into the game. Knight d8 to f7, and it might contribute to the attack on the king's side. All in all, I think Wesley has come out of the opening pretty well because he's managed to get that dark square bishop. But it's still in the balance. A4 puts a little bit of pressure. It means that, well, knight d8 here, probably not very good because of the trouble on the A file, and you want to be able to recapture with the pawn. You don't want to recapture with the bishop because, yeah, somehow, after the rook moves, let's say here, bishop here, that route with the knight around to f7 is a bit fraught when there's potential for that rook to come into the position, or maybe bishop a4, knight into a4, a5, and then c6. That's not too clever. So this maneuver, which one would like to play to actually improve the position, knight, not so easy. So g5. Wesley just leaves that knight there and gets on with the kingside attack. So basically, black has a very clear option here to play h5 and g4, and it looks like one of those King's Indian pawn storms, and in combination with the queen on b6, that's very, very nice because the pawn can come to g3 potentially as well. So Van Foreest decides, okay, let's chop the rooks off and then play knight h2. So he's dragged a rook away. I mean, I don't think he really needed to exchange rooks. Actually, let me just come back to that position because that's interesting. I'm just wondering whether he was worried about this option, about the queen coming into d4. I don't know. That still doesn't look right coming there. So yeah, he could have played knight h2. I'm not quite sure why he felt the need to exchange off the pawns and the rooks actually. But it's a very double-edged position still. Bishop d1. So that prevents the pawn coming to g4 and of course attacks the pawn on h5. King covers, and now the bishop mounts his round and looks at the b5 pawn, and of course frees the way for the rook. Queen c3, so that protects this pawn and means potentially the knight can come into a5. Bishop d8, so Wesley looking to play the bishop to that diagonal at some point. Knight b3. Queen c7. An exchange of queens is certainly advantageous for black because here that rook can't get into the game. All these squares are covered. This b pawn is threatened. The bishop is going to come to b6. It looks great for black. If that pawn drops, then that knight doesn't need to find a square on the king side. It's going to find a good square eventually on c5. So Van Foreest avoids the exchange and heads over towards the king side, and that gives a little bit of a clue as to potential counterplay here. Bishop e8. I mean, this looks very impressive, but there's a big space behind those pawns, so if white ever breaks through, that will be pretty fraught for the king. Watch out for moves like h4. And if g4, then, already maybe just sacking a piece. That's kind of interesting. That is probably doesn't work at this moment, but, it's kind of option that one has to consider. Rook c1, attacking the queen. And here, maybe a safe move is to play queen queen e7, and then bishop b6. But queen h7 from Wesley, which actually looks very attractive. The queen hits here, and maybe bishop g6 is coming to attack that pawn. But it does allow white some very interesting ideas. Now, here, Van Foreest played what to me looks like a very natural move, plonking the rook on c6, the outpost there, which looks in this direction towards the king, and also prevents black from playing bishop b6. Before I look at rook c6, there's a fascinating alternative, excuse me, and that is pawn to g4. So this didn't happen, but I just want to show you a couple of variations. So if black ignores that and let's say takes here, then it's possible to take on h5, and that gives white the option to check here. And suddenly, yeah, black is taking some important pawns, but the king is very open. That knight is on a fantastic square. You know, that bishop certainly can't move here because of a check. And this is just actually a really double-edged position. And what about closing with h4? Well, here, let's look at this again. Queen c3. Okay, looking to get in on c8. Queen takes pawn. Now, watch this. Queen hits the knight, threatens to check on e6. If queen takes bishop, queen e6 check, and now a beautiful move for white. Knight d4, fantastic idea, exploiting that pin, and then knight f5, check comes, and the queen and knight will be too much for the king. Why throw in g4? Well, it means in this position, basically, if you imagine that pawn on g2 and the pawn on h5, with the pawn on g2, then queen d3 would cover the f5 square, but g4 is thrown in because it supports the knight, so queen d3 has no effect at all. Okay, that is a complex variation, a computer variation, of course, I freely admit, but I think a really interesting idea, because g4 looks very strange as it closes the king side, and so you'd think, well, black wants that because he's going to do well on the other side of the board, but yeah, suddenly it's not so clear. And yeah, a very cute tactical point that pawn will support a knight coming to f5. So what I'm saying is it's really complicated. G4 wouldn't give white a winning position, but yeah, very interesting tactical ideas. So instead, rook c6 was played, which to my eyes looks like a very natural move. You know, you often see this kind of move in the King's Indian, where white uses the outpost, that jumping off point, to sack an exchange, because the pawn will, you know, take the place of the rook, and that's very, very powerful. In fact, of course, in this case, it actually wins that piece on b7. The knight can't even move out of the way to anywhere safe. So it feels like a really natural and pretty normal move, actually, for this kind of position. So rook takes b4. And now another really interesting move, knight c5. And this reminds me of a tile game, actually, which I hope I'll show you perhaps after this. There are interesting similarities. So knight c5, obviously pawn can't take, that's against the rules, that's pinned. A check from the rook, the knight came back, and now, well, Wesley went for g4. I mean, this is just a crazy position. And of course, the players were running very short of time as well, just to add to the chaos. In fact, it is possible to take that knight. This looks very frightening. Rook takes, check, and hits the bishop. But incredibly, black is doing well in this position. If you play bishop f6, rook takes, king takes, and now the rook has to move, and then black will take on e4. So rook f5 blocks that, but after this move, rook b3, the queen is somewhat embarrassed. It has no good square to move to. And that is a big issue. You've got to put the knight in the way. Even this isn't completely clear because there are potential to take here. But with a few delicate steps, then actually black is better here. Black is now a piece up and should win. Still a little bit chaotic. Of course, and that's another computer variation. I mean, such moves like this would be very, very hard to anticipate, if not impossible, in a rapid play game when you're short of time. And Wesley played instead, again, a kind of very human move. So knight c5 has just been played. He went pawn to g4. And the idea is that after pawn takes pawn, he's now able to take that rook because there's no longer queen takes pawn check available. That's important. But there's all kinds of other things going on. g5 check opens things up. So watch out for that one. Therefore, king takes. But now knight e6 check. So Wesley is a whole rook up here. But there's a lot to negotiate. With the king starting to open up, that knight is on a fantastic square. Here, queen h3 was played, which looks tempting to get the queen in. But actually, pawn takes bishop is a very strong move. Takes on b7. And then queen h4 check. And actually, white just has a really strong attack here. Watch out that bishop on d8 can be taken. So pawn takes would have been very good for white. But instead, queen h3. And after queen h3, well, actually, after this, black is okay. What's the score at the moment? Well, white is a rook down. Van Foreest managed to get a piece back, but Wesley is still an exchange up. Can he consolidate? Well, he can indeed. It's hard for the queen to achieve that much on its own. Careful of something happening here, but bishop g4 is actually pretty safe. And white's problem, of course, is that knight simply can't take part in the attack. And now, well, this is a very nice move. Finally, this kingside pawn storm actually evolves to good effect. This opens up the king. Remember, after this, there's potential. Well, you can take here, actually. Let me just show that. Takes, opens this up, and the king is toast. So queen takes, queen f6, queen d7, and, well, here, I mean, there are lots of ways to win. b4 is okay. Wesley played rook c1. Frankly, I'm not quite sure why he played that one, but it's basically he's in control. He's doesn't spoil the position at all. If queen takes pawn, then you can play here, and rook c2 check, and, well, black's attack is going to steam through. The game finished like this. Queen g4 check, d6, takes on f2, queen takes d6, a few checks. In fact, the king is actually running away. Is actually pretty safe. Can run around the the queen. Queen b7. And queen c5 check was the final move of the game. Van Foreest resigned. If king e2, queen c4, and check. And, well, it's not quite mate, but that's a simple move, exchanging off the queens, and black has an extra rook. So there we go. Just shows how complex the Spanish opening is. White doesn't always win. It doesn't always go white's way. It's just a difficult position. But I think the key move back here was being able to exchange off that dark squared bishop. Bishops are important pieces. and particularly in these kind of positions where those dark squares are permanently weak now. And actually, well, we saw around here, finally, those dark squares, I'm afraid, paid for white, or paid for black, whichever way around you look at it. And white suffered on this diagonal, basically. That was the problem. There we go. Well, as I said, Wesley, very convincing winner of this tournament. I was commentating live on Chess24, and it's fascinating to see how he plays. He's somehow on a different beat to everyone else. He plays in a very different way. Perhaps, if I've got time, I'll try and show you another of his games. But I do want to show you a game of tiles, which has some similarities to that. So look out for a tile game, a spectacular tile game coming soon. Don't forget, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Let's try and hit 100k. If you're not a subscriber, do click that subscribe button and the bell for instant notifications. And, well, thanks for watching.